At her great-grandson's baptism, a 72-year-old grandmother was publicly called the shrew of the family. She didn't argue. She simply handed her daughter-in-law a sealed envelope. Minutes later, the woman who insulted her suddenly turned pale. Something inside that letter was about to unravel an entire family. There are moments in family life that look perfectly ordinary from the outside. A church gathering. A celebration. A room filled with smiling relatives and soft conversation. But if you listen carefully, sometimes beneath those quiet moments there is another story unfolding. One made of years of silence, small humiliations, and truths that have been waiting far too long to be spoken. I came across a story like that not long ago, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It began on a Sunday morning inside a small chapel where a family had gathered for a baptism. The kind of ceremony that is supposed to represent beginnings, blessings, new life. But on that day something else happened. A 72-year-old woman stood in the back of the church, watching her own family from a distance as if she were a stranger who had wandered in by accident. Her name was Margaret Whitaker. She had chosen her dress carefully that morning, a navy blue one she reserved for important occasions. Around her neck hung a small gold cross that had once belonged to her late husband. She adjusted it nervously as she stepped inside the chapel, breathing in the scent of lilies and candle wax that drifted through the room. At the front of the church, the priest prepared the baptismal font. In a few moments, Margaret's great-grandson would be blessed. For most people, that moment would be pure joy. But Margaret wasn't standing with the family. She wasn't beside her son. She wasn't near the baby. She was in the back row, quietly observing everything like someone who had been invited, but not truly welcomed. If you've spent enough time thinking about family relationships, you start to recognize moments like this. The ones that make you ask uncomfortable questions. How does a grandmother end up standing alone at her own great-grandchild's baptism? How many years does it take for someone to be slowly pushed out of a family without anyone openly saying it? Margaret had asked herself those same questions for a long time. 15 years to be exact. 15 years of smaller and smaller invitations. 15 years of phone calls that were never returned. 15 years of being told things like, "We're keeping it small this year." Or, "You probably wouldn't enjoy the crowd." And if you've ever seen this kind of thing happen in real life, you know how confusing it can be. Because no single moment looks cruel enough to protest. It's just 1,000 small distances that slowly add up. That morning, after the ceremony ended, families gathered in the church hall for the reception. Margaret waited patiently near the doorway, holding a carefully wrapped gift in both hands. It was a knitted blanket. She had made it herself. Weeks of work, stitching the baby's name delicately into the corner. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then she stepped forward and gently asked to hold the baby. And that's when the room changed. Her daughter-in-law Vanessa appeared beside her with a polite smile that didn't quite hide the tension underneath. Before anyone could hand Margaret the child, Vanessa spoke. Lightly, almost joking. "This is Daniel's mother," she told the women standing nearby. "The shrew of the family." People often imagine that insults explode loudly, but the most painful ones sometimes arrive quietly, like that word did. Shrew. A word that landed in the room like a small stone dropped into still water. For a few seconds Margaret said nothing. And if you had been standing there watching her, you might have expected the reaction most people have in moments like that. Anger. Embarrassment. Tears. Instead, Margaret reached slowly into her handbag. She removed a sealed envelope, walked over to Vanessa, and placed it directly into her hand. "You should read this," Margaret said calmly. "Later. When you're alone." What happened next lasted only a second, but it told Margaret everything she needed to know. Because for the first time that morning, Vanessa looked afraid. And that's where the real story begins. Before we go any further, if you're someone who finds meaning in stories about family, dignity, and the complicated truths that shape our lives, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This is Empathetic Story, and your support helps keep these conversations going. Now let's go back to that church. Because the envelope Margaret handed over that morning didn't just contain a secret. It contained the beginning of a truth that would unravel 15 years of silence. That single moment in the church, the envelope resting in Vanessa's hand and the brief flicker of fear in her eyes, did not appear out of nowhere. Moments like that are rarely spontaneous. They are usually the result of years of quiet experiences that slowly reshape how someone understands their place in the world. To understand why Margaret Whittaker stood so calmly in that room, you have to look backward. Because the story of that envelope really began long before the baptism. Margaret had not always been a woman who felt like a guest in her own family. Decades earlier, she had been something entirely different. A young widow trying to build a life for herself and her son after tragedy struck far too early. Her husband Harold had died when Margaret was only 26 years old. One moment she had been part of a small but stable family, and the next she was standing in a hospital hallway with a 3-year-old child holding her hand and a future that suddenly looked uncertain. People sometimes talk about resilience as if it appears naturally in moments like that. But the truth is, resilience is usually built out of necessity. Margaret worked wherever she could. Mornings at the local library. Evenings cleaning office buildings downtown. During those years she often returned home after midnight, only to wake up a few hours later and prepare breakfast for her son before school. Later she enrolled in night classes, determined to earn a teaching degree, so she could provide something more stable for their future. Those years were exhausting, but they were also deeply meaningful. Margaret and her son Daniel became a kind of team. They built routines that belonged only to them. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and homework at the kitchen table. Science fair projects spread across the living room floor. Baseball games where Margaret sat in the bleachers cheering louder than anyone else. There were no expensive vacations. No luxurious holidays. But there was love, and there was effort. And there was the quiet pride of watching a child grow into a thoughtful young man. When Daniel left for college, Margaret believed the hardest part of her journey was finally behind her. What she didn't realize at the time was that another, more subtle challenge was waiting just ahead. That challenge arrived in the form of a woman named Vanessa. Daniel met Vanessa during his second year at university. She was intelligent, confident, and came from a family that moved comfortably in circles Margaret had never been part of. Her father owned a successful consulting firm, and her mother had built a reputation organizing charity events across the city. At first, Margaret tried hard to welcome Vanessa into the family. She brought homemade meals to their apartment when the young couple was overwhelmed with work. She offered to help when their first child was born. She listened politely to stories about business dinners and networking events that felt far removed from her own experiences. But somewhere in those early years, something subtle began to change. It didn't happen with arguments or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it appeared in smaller moments that were easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. A dinner invitation that arrived a little later than usual. A family gathering that Margaret heard about only after it had already happened. Phone calls that Vanessa answered quickly but ended just as quickly, always explaining how busy the household had become. Margaret told herself these things were normal. Young families had complicated schedules. Careers demanded attention. She didn't want to become the kind of mother-in-law who interfered too much. So she stepped back. And then she stepped back a little more. Years passed. 2 grandchildren were born, Olivia and Ethan. Margaret loved them deeply, but her time with them became strangely limited. When she offered to babysit, Vanessa gently insisted that professional childcare worked better for their routines. When Margaret sent gifts for birthdays or holidays, the children rarely mentioned them afterward. At first she assumed they had forgotten. Later she wondered if perhaps she had misjudged the situation. And eventually she stopped asking. Looking back, Margaret would later realize something that many people only understand much later in life. Distance in families rarely appears overnight. It grows quietly, one polite boundary at a time. By the time 15 years had passed, Margaret's role in the family had become something difficult to define. She was still technically part of it, but she was no longer truly inside it. And that was the quiet history standing behind her that morning in the church, holding a knitted blanket in her hands and wondering, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, how a grandmother could slowly become a stranger in her own family. And yet, while Margaret spent those years trying to understand how distance had quietly grown inside her family, she had no idea that a discovery was waiting that would change the way she saw everything. The moment itself was almost ordinary. It happened on a quiet winter afternoon just a few days before Christmas. The kind of day when houses feel warm and familiar and nothing seems likely to disrupt the rhythm of family life. Daniel had asked his mother to stop by for a simple favor. His laptop was filled with years of photographs, vacations, birthdays, school events, and he wanted help organizing them into folders before printing a few for holiday cards. Margaret had always been patient with small tasks like that. She sat beside him at the dining room table while he spoke casually about work deadlines and travel plans for the coming year. Outside the window, the sky was already dimming with early winter light. They began opening folders one by one. Family vacation photos, pictures of the children when they were younger, a few awkward snapshots from office parties. Nothing unusual. Margaret clicked through the files slowly, occasionally smiling when a familiar memory appeared on the screen. Daniel stepped away at one point to answer a phone call in the other room, leaving her to continue sorting. And that was when it happened. She opened the wrong folder. At first she assumed the images were simply from a different event Daniel had forgotten to label properly. But as the photographs loaded across the screen, something about them immediately felt out of place. Vanessa appeared in the first picture. She was standing outside what looked like a restaurant. Beside her was a man Margaret had never seen before. The second photo showed them seated at a small table, leaning toward each other in conversation. The third showed them walking together through a city park. Individually, the images could have meant many things. People meet colleagues for lunch. Friends share conversations. It was possible, Margaret told herself immediately, that there was a reasonable explanation. But something about the way they stood together unsettled her. It was subtle, not dramatic. The kind of thing that only becomes visible when you have lived long enough to recognize the language of human behavior. The way Vanessa's hand rested lightly on the man's arm. The ease in their expressions. The closeness that suggested familiarity rather than coincidence. Margaret felt her hand go still. On the computer mouse. For a few seconds she simply stared at the screen. Her first instinct was disbelief. After all, families build their lives on assumptions of loyalty and trust. Those assumptions are rarely questioned unless something forces you to look more closely. And yet, once that possibility enters your mind, it becomes difficult to ignore. Margaret heard Daniel's voice returning from the hallway, still speaking on his phone. In that brief moment she had a choice to make. She could confront him immediately. She could ask questions she might not want the answers to. Or she could close the folder and pretend she had never seen it. Many people believe honesty always demands immediate action. But life inside families is rarely that simple. Truth, when it appears unexpectedly, can feel like a fragile object. Once you expose it, you cannot control what it breaks. Margaret closed the folder. Quietly. By the time Daniel returned to the table, she had already moved on to another set of pictures. He continued talking about travel schedules and work projects, completely unaware that anything had changed. But something had. Margaret drove home later that evening with the strange heaviness that follows an unsettling realization. She tried to convince herself that there might be an explanation she had not yet considered. Perhaps the man was a colleague. Perhaps the photographs captured moments that meant nothing beyond simple friendship. Still, the images remained in her mind. Days passed. Then weeks. And eventually Margaret did something she had not originally intended to do. She returned to her computer and printed one of the photographs she had seen that afternoon. She sat down at her kitchen table with a sheet of paper and began writing a letter. Not an angry letter. Not a threat. But a careful, measured message addressed directly to Vanessa. Margaret explained how she had accidentally come across the photograph while helping Daniel organize the family files. She wrote that she hoped there was an explanation that would make everything she had seen harmless. And yet she also wrote something else. Something that had been forming in her thoughts for months without words. Families survive on honesty. Not perfection. Not appearances. Honesty. She folded the letter slowly when she finished and placed the photograph inside the envelope. Then she sealed it. For 6 months that envelope remained in the top drawer of Margaret's dresser. She never showed it to Daniel. She never mentioned it to anyone. In truth, she hoped she would never have to use it. Because interfering in someone else's marriage, especially your own child's, is not a step anyone takes lightly. But standing in that church months later, hearing herself reduced to a cruel nickname in front of relatives and strangers alike, Margaret finally realized something she had been unwilling to admit. Silence had not protected her place in the family. Silence had only allowed someone else to define it. And so when she placed the envelope into Vanessa's hand that morning, she was not simply revealing a secret. She was drawing a boundary that had been waiting 15 years to be acknowledged. And once the envelope changed hands in that quiet corner of the church reception, the story entered a phase that anyone who studies family dynamics will recognize immediately. The uneasy calm that arrives before the truth begins to surface. Margaret Whittaker did not stay long after the reception ended. She offered polite goodbyes, the same careful smile she had practiced for years, and walked out of the church into the bright afternoon light. For a moment she simply stood on the steps, letting the cool air settle around her. Inside the building, laughter resumed. People returned to their conversations. From the outside, it might have looked as if nothing unusual had happened. But Margaret knew something had shifted. The look Vanessa had given her, brief, controlled but unmistakably startled, told her that the envelope had landed exactly where it needed to. The drive back to her apartment felt strangely long. Margaret gripped the steering wheel and watched the familiar streets pass by. But her mind kept circling back to the same thought. True. That was the word Vanessa had chosen. After 15 years of careful restraint, 15 years of trying not to become the stereotype of the interfering mother-in-law, that was how she had been described in front of a room full of people. A nuisance. An embarrassment. Someone to be tolerated rather than respected. When Margaret finally reached her apartment building, the late afternoon sun was fading behind the rooftops. She climbed the stairs slowly, unlocked her door, and stepped into the quiet living room that had been her refuge for many years. The silence inside felt heavier than usual. Margaret slipped off her shoes and sank into the familiar armchair near the window. The chair had been part of her life for decades, surviving 3 different homes and countless changes. Across the room stood the old grandfather clock her husband Harold had once restored piece by piece. Its steady ticking filled the apartment with a sound that felt strangely comforting. Margaret leaned her head back and closed her eyes. "What would you have done, Harold?" she murmured softly into the empty room. It was the kind of question widows sometimes ask long after their partners are gone. Vanessa sometimes says things without thinking. Margaret watched the shadows lengthen across the floor. She thought about the years of small dismissals, the careful way Vanessa had framed every disagreement so that Margaret appeared unreasonable. And for the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to apologize for existing. "No," Margaret said calmly. She wasn't joking. Daniel hesitated. Then the question came again, sharper this time. What was in that letter? Margaret considered telling him everything in that moment. She could have described the photographs, the months of uncertainty, the careful letter she had written in hopes of protecting the marriage rather than destroying it. But something told her that the truth needed to reach him through the right door. And that door was not hers to open. "You should ask Vanessa," Margaret said. The silence that followed was longer this time. Finally Daniel spoke again. "I will." The call ended soon after. Margaret placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly as the room darkened around her. Somewhere across town, the envelope now sat in Daniel's house. And for the first time in 15 years, a story that had been carefully controlled by one voice was about to face another version of the truth. Not through accusation, not through anger, but through a simple question that could no longer be avoided. What exactly was inside that letter? And yet, after that phone call ended, nothing happened immediately. If you have ever watched the truth slowly unfold inside a family, you know this stage well. The moment when something important has been set in motion, but the outcome is still invisible. No arguments. No confessions. Just a quiet stretch of time where everyone is thinking, wondering, and perhaps realizing things they had never allowed themselves to question before. For Margaret Whittaker, those next few days felt unusually long. Her phone remained on the small table beside her armchair. She continued with her normal routines, watering the plants on her balcony, folding laundry, preparing simple meals, but every now and then she would glance toward the phone. Not because she expected it to ring, because part of her knew that when it finally did, something in her life would change. The first day passed without a call. Then the second. By the third morning, Margaret noticed something unexpected happening inside herself. The anxiety she had felt after the baptism was beginning to fade. In its place was something quieter. A sense of release. For 15 years she had measured every word carefully around Daniel and Vanessa. She had tried to be patient, supportive, respectful of boundaries she didn't always understand. She had convinced herself that silence was the price of staying connected to her grandchildren. But now that silence had finally broken. And strangely enough, Margaret realized she could breathe more easily than before. On the fourth morning she woke earlier than usual. Instead of making the quick cup of tea she normally settled for, she cooked a proper breakfast: eggs, toast, and fresh coffee. It may sound like a small detail, but moments like that often signal something deeper. When people begin reclaiming their own lives, it usually starts with ordinary decisions that feel slightly unfamiliar. Margaret finished washing the dishes and was drying her hands when the phone rang. Her heart lifted slightly. For a brief moment she assumed it must be Daniel. But when she looked at the screen she saw a different name. Clara Benson. Clara had once been Margaret's closest friend. Their children had grown up together, which meant the two women had spent years sharing everyday life, school events, birthday parties, long conversations in the parking lot after soccer practice. Over time, as their families followed different paths, their contact had become less frequent. They still exchanged occasional calls and holiday cards, but the closeness of those earlier years had gradually faded. Margaret answered. "Clara? It's been a while." Clara's warm laugh came through the phone immediately. "It has, hasn't it? I don't know why, Margaret, but I woke up this morning thinking about you." The sincerity in her voice softened something in Margaret's chest. "How are you?" Clara asked. It was a simple question, but Margaret realized it had been a long time since someone had asked it without rushing toward another topic. She hesitated for a moment. Then slowly the story began to unfold. Margaret didn't mention every detail. She avoided describing the photograph or the envelope, but she spoke about the years of distance, the baptism, and the strange feeling of standing in a room full of relatives while realizing you had somehow become an outsider. Clara listened quietly. Occasionally she murmured a small word of sympathy, the way people do when they understand that interruption would only break the rhythm of someone finally speaking honestly. When Margaret finished, there was a short silence. Then Clara said something Margaret hadn't expected. "I'm sorry you went through that." Margaret nodded silently. "But I'm also proud of you." The word surprised her. "Proud?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Clara replied gently, "because you stopped pretending everything was fine." Margaret stood by the kitchen counter considering that. Clara continued. "Listen, I've been attending a small gathering at the community center every Wednesday. It's mostly women around our age. Some widowed, some divorced, some just trying to figure out what life looks like after the roles we spent decades playing." Margaret felt a quiet curiosity stir inside her. "What do you do there?" she asked. "Mostly talk," Clara said. "Drink coffee. Sometimes laugh more than we expected to." She paused, then added softly, "I think you should come with me tomorrow." Margaret's first instinct was hesitation. What if Daniel called? What if Vanessa finally decided to explain the letter? But then another thought surfaced. For years Margaret had organized her time around the possibility of family visits that rarely happened. Perhaps it was time to organize her life differently. "I'd like that," she said. After they hung up, Margaret walked to the living room and picked up an old photograph from the bookshelf. It showed Daniel as a teenager standing beside her at his high school graduation, both of them smiling with the uncomplicated optimism of people who believed the future would always move forward together. For the first time in many years, Margaret realized something important. She was still more than someone's mother. Still more than someone's grandmother. She was Margaret Whittaker. And the next chapter of her life might finally belong to her. And while Margaret was beginning to rediscover parts of her life that had long been set aside, the quiet tension she had left behind in Daniel's house was slowly working its way toward the surface. About a week after the baptism, Margaret returned home from the community center later than usual. The afternoon with Clara and the other women had been unexpectedly comforting. They had sat in a loose circle, talking about the strange experience of reaching a stage in life where children are grown, routines have shifted, and people must decide who they are beyond the roles they once carried every day. Margaret hadn't spoken much during the meeting, but she had listened carefully, and listening had reminded her of something simple but important. Families are complicated everywhere. No one arrives at this stage of life without a few quiet disappointments tucked into their history. When she stepped into her apartment that afternoon, the small red light on her answering machine was blinking. Margaret paused for a moment before pressing the button. "Mom, it's Daniel." His voice sounded tired. "Please call me back. I think we need to talk." Margaret stood there for a moment, letting the words settle. There was no anger in his tone this time, only strain. She picked up the phone and dialed his number. Daniel answered almost immediately. "Mom." "Yes." There was a brief silence. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice lower than usual. "Can I come over?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "I think it would be better if we talked face to face." "I'll be there in about half an hour," he said. When the call ended, Margaret moved through the apartment with a strange mix of anticipation and calm. She straightened the cushions on the sofa, wiped the kitchen counter, and put a pot of coffee on the stove. It had been years since Daniel had come to visit her simply to talk. Exactly 30 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. When Margaret opened it, she immediately noticed how different her son looked. Daniel's shoulders were slightly slumped, and the usual confidence in his posture had been replaced by something heavier. Dark circles framed his eyes, the kind that appear when someone has not slept well. "Come in," Margaret said gently. Daniel stepped inside and glanced around the apartment, as if seeing it with fresh attention. Margaret poured coffee into 2 mugs and placed one in his hands. They sat across from each other in the living room. For several moments neither of them spoke. Finally Daniel exhaled slowly. "The letter," he said. Margaret nodded. "Yes." Daniel stared down at the mug between his hands. "She showed it to me last night." Margaret waited. "She admitted the man in the photo is real," Daniel continued. "But she said it was nothing serious. Just someone she had been helping through a difficult situation." Daniel gave a small tired laugh. "But something about the way she said it didn't feel right." Margaret remained quiet. "So this morning," he continued, "I checked her phone." The room felt suddenly very still. "There were hundreds of messages," Daniel said quietly. "Conversations going back more than a year." Margaret felt a familiar sadness settle in her chest. Not because the truth surprised her, because she had hoped she might be wrong. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. It wasn't just friendship. He looked up at his mother, his expression filled with the painful clarity that comes when someone realizes they have misunderstood their own life. "I feel like a fool," he said. Margaret leaned forward and gently placed her hand over his. For the first time in years Daniel did not pull away. "You're not a fool," she said softly. "But the worst part isn't even the messages," Daniel continued. Margaret studied his face. "All those things Vanessa told me about you," he said quietly. "About how difficult you were. How you criticized everything she did. How you were always interfering." Margaret listened without interrupting. "I believed her," Daniel said. He shook his head slowly. "And because I believed her, I let her push you out of our lives." The silence between them carried the weight of years. Finally Daniel spoke again. "I'm sorry, Mom." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes people see things clearly only when they are ready to look," she said. Daniel nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's something else," he said after a moment. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What is it?" Daniel stood and walked toward the hallway. When he returned, he was carrying a large cardboard box Margaret had not noticed when he arrived. He placed it carefully on the coffee table. "I found this in the house," he said quietly. Margaret looked at the box with a faint sense of unease. "What is it?" Daniel opened the lid. "I think," he said, "it's something you need to see." And as Margaret leaned forward to look inside, she had the sudden feeling that the truth she had uncovered about Vanessa was only the beginning of a much larger story waiting to be revealed. And as Margaret leaned forward to see what Daniel had placed on the coffee table, she sensed that the story she thought she understood was about to reveal something far more unsettling. The cardboard box looked ordinary, the kind people use to store old papers or photographs in the back of a closet. Nothing about it suggested significance at first glance. But the way Daniel stood beside it, hands resting on the edges, shoulders slightly tense, told Margaret that whatever was inside had already shaken him. He lifted the lid slowly. For a moment Margaret didn't recognize what she was seeing. The box was filled with envelopes. Dozens of them. Some were white. Others cream-colored. A few had small holiday stickers still attached to the corners. Margaret reached out and picked one up. The handwriting on the front stopped her breath. It was hers. Her own careful script written across the envelope. To Olivia. Her granddaughter. Margaret opened it slowly. Inside was a birthday card. A small one, decorated with bright balloons. She remembered buying it clearly. 3 years earlier she had included a short message about how proud she was of Olivia's school achievements, along with a bookstore gift card tucked inside. Margaret had waited weeks after mailing that card. She remembered glancing at her phone occasionally, expecting a call or a quick thank you message. None ever came. At the time she had told herself teenagers sometimes forget things like that. Now the card sat in her hands, still sealed until this very moment. Margaret looked up at Daniel. He nodded quietly. There's more. She reached deeper into the box. Another envelope. A Christmas card addressed to Ethan. Then another. And another. Each one carried the same unmistakable handwriting. Each one had never been opened. The realization moved through Margaret slowly, like a cold draft through an old house. These were never delivered, she said softly. Daniel shook his head. No. Margaret stared down at the stack of envelopes. Years of small gestures. Birthday wishes. Holiday greetings. Short notes asking about school projects, sports games, music recitals. Each one had been written carefully, mailed with hope, and then quietly intercepted. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. She told me you stopped sending things years ago, he said. She said you had lost interest. Margaret felt a tightening in her chest that surprised her. Not anger. Something deeper. A quiet grief for all the moments that had been silently erased. She reached further into the box. Near the bottom she found something larger. A worn leather-bound photo album. The sight of it made her freeze. My album, she whispered. Margaret had believed that album had disappeared during Daniel's move to a new house several years earlier. She had searched for it everywhere, convinced it had been misplaced in the chaos of packing. Daniel watched her carefully. She took it, he said. Margaret opened the album slowly. Inside were photographs from Daniel's childhood. His first day of kindergarten. A science fair project built across their kitchen table. A baseball game where he stood proudly in an oversized uniform while Margaret cheered from the bleachers. Page after page documented the years they had struggled through together. Margaret turned the pages carefully. Every photograph represented a memory Vanessa had tried to remove from the family's present. Daniel spoke quietly. The letter you gave her. It wasn't just about the photo you found, was it? Margaret closed the album gently. No, she said. Daniel looked at her, waiting. The photograph was only part of it, Margaret continued. I reminded her of something she seemed determined to forget. Daniel glanced down at the album resting on the table. Our history, he said. Margaret nodded. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The room felt filled with invisible pieces of the past, birthday candles that had once been blown out, school awards proudly carried home, small victories that had shaped a boy into a man. Finally Daniel exhaled slowly. She didn't just lie to me, he said. She erased things. Margaret didn't respond immediately, because in that moment she understood something that had taken 15 years to fully reveal itself. She had not simply drifted away from her family. Someone had been quietly pushing her out. And the evidence of that quiet erasure sat right there in front of them. A cardboard box filled with unopened love. And once the truth inside that cardboard box was finally laid out between them, it became impossible for Daniel to return to the version of reality he had lived with for so many years. For a long time after that evening, Margaret often reflected on how quietly life can change direction. There had been no shouting that day. No dramatic confrontation. Just a box of letters, an old photo album, and the realization that an entire story about their family had been quietly rewritten. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to face the consequences of that discovery. Conversations inside his house became tense and difficult. Trust, once broken open, has a way of exposing every small fracture beneath it. The messages on Vanessa's phone could not be ignored, and the evidence inside the box made something else painfully clear. The distance between Margaret and the grandchildren had never been accidental. Daniel asked questions. Some Vanessa tried to answer. Others she avoided. But once doubt enters a relationship, it rarely disappears again. 3 months after the baptism, Daniel made a decision that surprised many people in the extended family. He filed for divorce. It was not an act of anger. It was a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had been broken long before that envelope appeared in the church. For Margaret, the months that followed felt both heavy and strangely hopeful. She never celebrated the end of her son's marriage. Anyone who has lived long enough understands that divorce carries its own kind of grief, even when it becomes necessary. But something else began to change during that time. The relationship between Margaret and her grandchildren slowly started to rebuild. It began with a text message. One Saturday morning, Margaret's phone buzzed while she was watering the small plants on her balcony. The message came from Olivia. "Grandma, are you home today?" Margaret read the message twice before replying. "Of course I am." A little later that afternoon, Olivia arrived with her younger brother Ethan. Both teenagers looked slightly uncertain when Margaret opened the door. Children often feel caught between loyalties when adults around them are struggling. Margaret greeted them with warmth that had been waiting years to be expressed. "I made cookies," she said with a gentle smile. The smell of chocolate filled the kitchen as they sat around the table together. At first the conversation moved cautiously, school, friends, small everyday topics. But gradually something more honest began to emerge. Ethan noticed the photo album resting on the coffee table. "Dad showed us that," he said. Margaret nodded. "He told us Mom kept it hidden." Margaret chose her words carefully. "Families sometimes misunderstand each other," she said quietly. Olivia opened the album and began flipping through the pages. A photograph of Daniel as a teenager caught her attention. "He looks so happy here," she said. Margaret smiled softly. "He had just won his first science competition. We celebrated with pancakes that morning." Olivia looked thoughtful. "I wish we had heard more of these stories growing up." Margaret rested her hand gently on the album. "We still can," she replied. And they did. Over the next several months, a new rhythm slowly formed. Daniel moved into a smaller apartment closer to Margaret's building. The grandchildren began visiting more often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes simply to talk. Margaret continued attending the Wednesday gatherings at the community center with Clara, discovering that life after 70 still held room for friendship, laughter, and unexpected beginnings. Nearly a year after the baptism, Daniel arrived one afternoon carrying a small bundle in his arms. Margaret recognized the baby immediately. Her great-grandson, Daniel Thomas Bennett. "Mom," Daniel said quietly as he stepped inside. "I think it's time you properly meet him." Margaret felt tears rise in her eyes as Daniel gently placed the baby in her arms. The child looked up at her with wide curiosity. For a moment Margaret studied his tiny features. The same dimple Daniel had as a baby. The same steady gaze that seemed to search the world with quiet interest. "Hello, Daniel," she whispered softly. "I'm your great-grandmother." The baby responded with a small laugh. Across the room Daniel watched them, thoughtful. "For years," he said after a moment, "I thought peace meant avoiding uncomfortable truths." Margaret glanced up. "But maybe peace begins when someone finally tells them." Margaret looked down at the child in her arms and thought back to that morning in the church. The insult. The envelope. The years of silence that had led to that moment. She realized then that the decision she made that day had never been about revenge. It had been about something far simpler. Respect. Place. And the quiet courage to say, after many years of patience, that a life built on love deserves to be remembered honestly. When I think about Margaret Whittaker's story, what stays with me most is not the insult inside the church or even the secret inside the envelope. It's the quiet realization that dignity sometimes disappears not in dramatic moments, but in small compromises repeated over many years. Margaret did not lose her place in the family overnight. It happened slowly, through silence, through politeness, through the belief that keeping the peace was more important than protecting her own voice. And that is something many people recognize in their own lives. We stay quiet because we love our families. We avoid conflict because we fear breaking fragile relationships. Yet Margaret's story reminds us that silence can sometimes allow misunderstanding and manipulation to grow unchecked. What finally changed everything was not revenge or anger, but the simple courage to let the truth exist in the open. Once that happened, the entire family had the opportunity to see reality more clearly and begin rebuilding relationships on honesty rather than illusion. The deeper lesson here is about balance. Compassion and patience are important qualities in any family, but they should never require someone to erase themselves. Healthy relationships depend on mutual respect, clear communication, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths when necessary. In our own lives, we can apply this lesson by speaking honestly before resentment builds, by protecting our dignity without attacking others, and by remembering that maintaining peace should never mean accepting disrespect. Sometimes the most powerful step we can take is simply to stop pretending everything is fine and begin a calm, honest conversation. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have handed over that letter? Or would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Share your perspective in the comments so everyone can learn from different viewpoints. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family, empathy, and life lessons, please consider subscribing to the channel Empathetic Story. Your support helps the channel continue bringing meaningful stories and reflections in future videos.